Tension within the Justice Department is growing. Prosecutors suggested a 7-year prison sentence for former Trump friend and associate Roger Stone, but the president didn't like that too much. POTUS complained Stone had been treated poorly, and Trump even alleged on Twitter that the judge in the case is biased against Stone. So, of course, Attorney General Bill Barr requested a lighter sentence. Then the president tweeted out his appreciation, but none of that was coordinated. DOJ employees and Democrats are livid. The ripple effect of the Des Moines debacle is still being felt this week. The Iowa Democratic Party chairman, Troy Price, he resigned. A partial recanvassing of certain precincts is also going to get carried out next. And on today's show, we've got Hill reporter Julia Manchester, who was on the ground in New Hampshire. She's straight back. I hope she has some maple syrup. And she's in the studio to tell us all about the days leading up to the state's primary. I'm Jamal Simmons. Here's why you should care. We're only 2 contests in so far in the 2020 primary season, and so much has happened. Hill reporter Julia Manchester was up in New Hampshire covering the whole front line of the campaign trail, but now she's here with us in Washington. Julia, what did you see? Who did you see? And what did you learn?
We saw a lot, talked to a number of voters. I was following Pete Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar around in particular, also followed Joe Biden a little bit around when he was in the state, but really I think I probably saw the emergence of these 2 lanes, the progressive lane and the moderate lane. Talked to a couple of voters that would have crossed over. New Hampshire is famous for having a number of undecided voters. A lot of these voters don't make up their minds until they step into that voting booth. But it was fascinating to see what the voters were paying attention to in particular, what their top issues were, and which candidates they were leaning towards.
And what's so great about New Hampshire is it actually is a pretty small state. You can get from one event to another. So I guess you had a chance to see multiple candidates in the same day.
Absolutely. I mean, there were times when I went from Biden to Buttigieg to Klobuchar, but I think the biggest surprise out of all of this was Amy Klobuchar and how well she did. I think she benefited from Joe Biden's pretty poor performance in Iowa. She was able to step up in that moderate lane, and then she came into New Hampshire. And there was one event in Nashua that I went to, and I came up to this small middle school, and I noticed people wrapped around the block of the middle school. It was 26 degrees. It was snowing. And I was talking to a number of these voters, and they were just curious to see Amy Klobuchar. There were some supporters there, but a number of voters were curious. I later found out there were 1,100 voters or attendees at that event alone. So she was driving a lot of this talk. But I think coming out
That's a classic New Hampshire scene.
Exactly, classic New Hampshire scene. But I think the biggest takeaway coming out of this is that we've really seen the formation of these 2 lanes. You have Bernie Sanders leading the progressive lane. Warren has performed very poorly, I would say, in the state where her state that she represents neighbors. So Bernie Sanders is now obviously the progressive standard bearer. But on the moderate side, you have Pete Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar, and I'm interested to see how those 2 will really battle it out, because right now you don't have a clear standard bearer on that side. Okay,
so going forward, it seems like the 3 candidates at the top, frankly, Bernie Sanders, Pete Buttigieg, and Amy Klobuchar, are particularly struggling with the first 2, Buttigieg and Klobuchar, are struggling with all people of color, right. Latin Americans, Latinos, and African Americans. Bernie is doing well with younger voters of color, but he's really struggling with older voters of color, who seem to be the ones that make up the bulk of Democratic voters when you get into these next round of states, Nevada, South Carolina, and on into Super Tuesday. Could you detect anything from them in their stump speeches? Did they talk about issues that might be of interest to people of color going forward?
Not in New Hampshire. I think in New Hampshire, a lot of their speeches were geared towards New Hampshire voters, and obviously New Hampshire is a majority white state. They were talking about, however, they were still talking about issues like drug reform, prescription drug reform, opioids, which obviously impact all Americans, but in particular, we see it an issue in New Hampshire. But it'll be interesting to see how they change around their messaging to target those minority voters and voters of color going forward. Amy Klobuchar and Pete Buttigieg, though, are going to have a very uphill climb, because we are seeing that Amy Klobuchar is getting a bit more backlash now for her record as a prosecutor in Minnesota. And obviously, Pete Buttigieg has struggled with the African-American community. I think Sanders has probably improved his standing among minority voters. Hillary Clinton was obviously very popular with that voting group in 2016, but he's had 4 years to really build more of a relationship with these voters. And ultimately, I think I'm fascinated to see how voters in Nevada and South Carolina, who are older voters of color in particular, if they look at Joe Biden and say, look, this guy just isn't viable at this point. He's not competing well. Maybe we should go with Sanders, who may seem a bit more electable, or maybe they will lean towards a Buttigieg or Klobuchar. Because I think right now, among all Democrats, or at least most Democrats that I've talked to and in polling, the number one priority is picking out a candidate who can beat Donald Trump.
It does seem that way. And it's funny because in New Hampshire, ethnic food is like French Canadian.
Yes.
Right? Like,
yes. I went to a couple
poutine.
French Canadian restaurants. Yes, it's very good.
Exactly. All right. So then that happened, but we do see that the polls are starting to shift going forward. We're starting to see Biden slide in some places, and we're seeing this other factor rise up. Obviously, Pete Buttigieg, obviously Amy Klobuchar, and then there's sort of that third name that keeps coming up, which is Michael Bloomberg. I don't know if any voters mentioned Michael Bloomberg to you when you were in New Hampshire, but it seems like everywhere else outside of the first 4 states, Bloomberg's numbers are just going up and up and up. I wonder if he'll have an impact on that moderate lane you're talking about.
He absolutely will. And actually, I did talk to a number of voters who brought up Michael Bloomberg when they were listing off candidates they would like to see beat Trump. It was a Klobuchar, Buttigieg, and a Michael Bloomberg. And Michael Bloomberg is just pouring money, obviously, into these Super Tuesday states and really across the country. And actually, the New York Times Style section had a really interesting article out today about how his campaign is pouring money into meme companies and targeting Generation Z voters as well as millennial voters. So that was a little fascinating tidbit. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see how Michael Bloomberg really plays into all of this as well. And he actually has qualified for the Nevada Democratic debate next week. He's not on the ballot in Nevada, technically, but he could be on that debate stage, so that'll be a very interesting dynamic if he agrees to do that.
All right, and yes, when we see what happens in Nevada, speaking of Nevada, the culinary union out there is starting to have a back and forth with the Bernie Sanders campaign. They've been coming out pretty hard against Medicare for All toward their members, and now they've gotten some blowback from the Bernie Sanders folks. I don't know if you've seen any of those stories.
Yeah, I absolutely have, and I think it maybe illustrates some further tension between Bernie Sanders' camp and the Democratic establishment. Remember, the culinary union is a very big endorsement to get in the Democratic Party. It's probably, in Nevada, probably the most sought after in the state when it comes to unions or groups or organized labor. So, I think this is, once again, Bernie Sanders kind of challenging that status quo. And I think the culinary union there could be some concern on their end as to how influential they will be if someone like Bernie Sanders is basically coming in and kind of tearing up the playbook.
And keep in mind, the culinary union in Nevada, very closely associated with former Senator Harry Reid,
yes,
who is the epitome of the establishment. Mm-hmm. So there's great possibility that Harry Reid may be trying to put his thumb on the scale for former Vice President Joe Biden.
Oh,
but
definitely. I could see it.
We will see. All right, Julia, thank you for being here.
Thanks, Jamal.
Thanks for watching Hill TV on YouTube. Be sure to click subscribe and hit the bell so you know when we post new videos. And head to thehill.com for all the latest political news.